The lonely cowboy told the native woman hiding in the barn, "Pack your things. You'll stay with me." The wind moved across the empty land like it had somewhere important to be. It brushed against the dry grass, rattled loose fence wires, and carried dust through the fading light of evening. Daniel Mercer stood near the edge of his ranch, one hand resting on the wooden post of a fence he had repaired more times than he could count. The sky above him burned orange and purple as the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills. It was the kind of sunset most people would stop to admire. Daniel barely looked at it. He had lived on that stretch of land for almost 10 years, and in that time the ranch had become quieter than any place should be. There had once been laughter in the yard. There had once been small footsteps running across the porch. But now the only sounds were the wind, the cattle shifting in their pens, and the steady rhythm of his own boots on dry ground. Daniel was known in town as a serious man. He spoke when necessary and worked from sunrise to nightfall without complaint. Some said he had not always been this way. The older shopkeeper once told a traveler that Daniel used to smile easily, that he used to ride into town with pride in his eyes. But that was before sickness took his wife and young daughter in the same cold season. After that, something inside him had closed like a door that would not open again. That evening, he finished checking the horses and headed toward the barn to make sure everything was secure before night fell. Winter was slowly creeping closer, and the nights were already colder than they should have been. He moved with the same quiet strength he carried every day, his hat pulled low against the wind. As he reached the barn, he noticed something strange. The door, which he always left slightly open for air, was pushed wider than usual. He stopped walking. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He was careful by nature. Out on open land, a man learned to pay attention to small changes: a loose gate, a missing tool, a strange footprint in the dirt. Any of those things could mean trouble. He stepped closer and gently pushed the door open. It creaked loudly in the quiet evening. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Hay bales were stacked in their usual place. The old lantern hung from its hook. The smell of straw and animals filled the air. But then he heard it, a soft, quick breath. Not from a horse, not from a cow. A human breath. Daniel froze. He let his eyes adjust to the dim light inside the barn. Slowly he moved forward, his boots pressing softly against the dirt floor. The sound came again, sharper this time, like someone trying very hard not to be heard. "Who's there?" he asked calmly. There was no answer. He stepped around a stack of hay bales, and that was when he saw her. A young native woman crouched low behind the hay, her back pressed against the wooden wall. Her clothes were dusty and worn from travel. Her long dark hair fell loosely over her shoulders. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were alert, watching him carefully, ready to react if needed. For a moment, neither of them moved. She looked like she had not eaten properly in days. Her hands were tight against her sides, as if she was prepared to run at any second. Fear was written clearly across her face, but there was also strength there, a quiet determination that surprised him. Daniel did not reach for anything. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, studying the situation. The land around that region had been tense for months. News of small conflicts had traveled through towns and settlements. Fear had grown between communities who once traded peacefully. Many people had started looking at each other with suspicion instead of understanding. Daniel understood that helping her could bring questions. It could bring trouble. But as he stood there looking at her thin frame and tired eyes, he did not see danger. He saw someone who had nowhere else to go. "How long have you been in here?" he asked quietly. She hesitated before answering. 2 days. Her voice was soft but steady. 2 days. That meant she had survived the cold nights in the barn without proper food or warmth. Daniel glanced at a small cloth bundle near her feet. It likely held everything she owned. "You alone?" he asked. She nodded. Silence filled the space between them again. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the wooden walls of the barn. Daniel remembered something his wife once told him. She used to say that sometimes the right thing to do feels risky, but that does not make it wrong. He had not thought about her words in a long time. The young woman's eyes flicked toward the open door, measuring the distance. She was deciding whether she could outrun him if she needed to. That thought made something inside him ache. No one should have to live in constant readiness to flee. He took a slow step back, creating space between them. "I'm not going to harm you," he said plainly. She watched him closely, searching for any sign of dishonesty. "What's your name?" he asked. After a long pause, she answered, "Yana." It was a beautiful name. It felt strong, like it belonged to someone who had survived more than she should have had to. "I'm Daniel," he replied. Another long silence passed. The air felt heavy with unspoken stories. He noticed how thin her wrists were, how her shoulders trembled slightly from the cold. The nights were only going to get worse. If she stayed in the barn much longer, she would not last. Daniel made a decision. "Pack your things," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You'll stay with me." Her eyes widened slightly. She did not expect that answer. He continued, "I've got a spare room. It's small, but it's warm." She did not move. "You don't owe me anything," he added, "and you can leave whenever you choose, but you won't stay in here another night." The wind howled outside as if to prove his point. Yana's gaze shifted toward the open fields beyond the barn door. There was nowhere else nearby. No lights, no shelter, only miles of open land. She slowly stood up. Her legs seemed stiff from crouching too long. She kept her distance from him but did not run. Daniel turned slightly, giving her space to gather her bundle. He walked ahead toward the house, making sure she could see that he carried no weapon in his hands. The ranch house stood a short distance away, its small windows glowing with faint lamplight. It was not a grand home. The paint was faded, the porch boards creaked, but it was solid and safe. As they walked, Daniel felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. For years, he had avoided bringing anyone into his home. It felt easier that way, less chance of losing something again. But tonight was different. He opened the front door and stepped aside so she could enter first. The warmth from the small fireplace reached them immediately. Inside, the house was simple. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books, a coat hanging near the door. Everything was clean but modest. Iana stood just inside the doorway, uncertain. "You can take the room at the end of the hall," Daniel said. "There's extra blankets in the chest." She nodded slowly. Before she disappeared down the hall, she paused. "Why?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at the fire for a moment before answering. "Because no one should have to hide in a barn," he said. It was a simple answer, but it was the truth. As she walked down the hallway, Daniel remained near the door, staring into the fire. The house already felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just less empty. Outside, the wind continued to sweep across the land, but inside the small ranch house, something had shifted. For the first time in years, Daniel Mercer was not alone. The first morning after Iana moved into the house, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He had barely slept. The sound of another person breathing under the same roof felt unfamiliar. Not unpleasant, just different. For years, his home had been filled only with silence and the crackle of the fireplace. Now, even the quiet seemed to carry a new weight. He stepped out of his room and walked toward the kitchen area. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving soft gray ashes behind. He added fresh wood and lit it carefully. As the flames slowly grew, he heard light footsteps from the hallway. Iana appeared, moving cautiously, as if she was unsure whether she truly belonged there. She had washed her face and tied her hair back neatly. The extra blanket he had given her was folded carefully over her arm. "You can keep that," Daniel said quietly, noticing the blanket. She hesitated, then nodded and placed it on the chair instead of returning it. "I'll make some breakfast," he said, though he was not used to announcing such things. She watched him for a moment, then spoke softly. "I can help." He shook his head. "You should rest. You look tired." She didn't argue, but she also didn't sit down. Instead, she stood near the table, observing the small kitchen with curious eyes. The house was simple, but everything had its place. Gianna seemed to understand order. She moved quietly, respectfully, as if careful not to disturb anything. Daniel cooked beans and heated leftover bread from the day before. It was not much, but it was warm. He placed a plate in front of her and noticed the way she paused before eating, almost as if she expected someone to take it away. "You're safe here," he said without looking directly at her. She gave a small nod and began to eat slowly at first, then with more hunger than she probably wanted to show. Outside, the wind had calmed. Sunlight slipped through the window, lighting the dust in the air. The ranch looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for the tension that lived in the nearby town. After breakfast, Daniel prepared to head outside to check on the cattle. He grabbed his hat and gloves. "You don't have to stay inside," he said. "You can walk around the yard if you want." She followed him out anyway. The cold air hit their faces as they stepped onto the porch. Iana stood still for a moment, taking in the open land. There was something different in her expression now. Not fear exactly, but awareness. She studied the fences, the barn, the horses, the wide sky stretching above them. Daniel watched her quietly. He wondered what she saw when she looked at this place. To him, it had become a reminder of what he had lost. To her, it might be a chance to begin again. He walked toward the barn and she followed at a distance. As he began checking the animals, she slowly moved closer. One of the horses lifted its head and sniffed the air. Gianna approached gently, her movements calm and careful. She reached out her hand, speaking softly in her own language. The horse relaxed almost immediately. Daniel noticed. "You've handled horses before," he said. She nodded. "My father taught me." There was a pause after she mentioned her father. Her eyes dropped slightly, but she didn't explain further. Daniel understood that silence. Some stories were too heavy to speak out loud. Over the next few days, a quiet routine began to form. Daniel worked as he always had, but now he was aware of someone else nearby. Yana did not sit idle. She began helping without being asked. She swept the porch, organized tools in the shed, and repaired a loose strap on one of the saddles using thread from her small bundle. At first, Daniel felt unsure about accepting her help. He did not want her to feel obligated. But she worked with quiet determination, not as someone paying a debt, but as someone choosing to contribute. One afternoon, while Daniel was fixing part of the fence that had broken during a storm weeks earlier, Ayana approached with a bundle of thin branches. "What are those for?" he asked. "For strengthening," she replied. "If you weave them through like this, the wind won't break it easily." She demonstrated with careful hands, sliding the branches between the wooden posts in a pattern he had never seen before. Daniel stepped back, watching closely. It worked. The fence stood firmer once she finished. He felt something close to admiration. "You know the land well." She gave a small smile. "The land teaches if you listen." Her words stayed with him longer than he expected. But while life at the ranch slowly settled, the town did not remain unaware. News traveled quickly in small places. It did not take long before someone riding past the ranch noticed a second figure working in the yard. A few days later, Daniel rode into town for supplies. As soon as he stepped into the general store, conversations shifted. He could feel eyes on him. The shopkeeper, an older man named Walter, leaned closer as he counted coins. "Heard you've got company," he said carefully. Daniel did not look up. "I do," Walter hesitated. "You sure that's wise?" Daniel met his gaze. "She needed shelter." "That may be," Walter replied, lowering his voice, "but folks are uneasy these days, you know that." Daniel did know. Fear had been growing for months. Stories, some true and some exaggerated, moved through the region like wildfire. But he also knew that fear often made people forget their humanity. She hasn't caused any trouble, Daniel said firmly. Walter sighed but said nothing more. When Daniel returned home that evening, Ayanna noticed the change in his expression. Something happened, she said quietly. Nothing important, he answered, though they both knew that was not entirely true. Days passed. The ranch began to feel less empty. They shared simple meals. Sometimes they spoke about small things, weather patterns, planting seasons, repairs that needed to be done. Other times they sat in silence by the fire, each lost in private thoughts but no longer alone. One night as the fire burned low, Ayanna finally spoke about why she had been hiding. There was trouble near my home, she said slowly. People were afraid, some left, some stayed. I chose to leave. Daniel did not ask for details. He could see in her eyes that leaving had not been easy. You can stay here as long as you need, he replied. She looked at him carefully. Even if people disapprove, he held her gaze. I don't make choices based on fear. For the first time, her expression softened completely. Trust, small but real, began to grow between them. The house changed in small ways. Yana placed a woven cloth from her bundle on the table. She arranged dried herbs near the kitchen window. The space felt warmer, not because of the fire, but because of presence. Daniel noticed he was speaking more than he had in years. He found himself explaining how the ranch used to look when it was thriving, how his daughter once tried to chase chickens across the yard. The memories still hurt, but sharing them did not feel as heavy as keeping them locked inside. Iana listened without interruption. She understood loss in her own way. Outside, winter crept closer. The nights grew longer. But inside the small ranch house, something steady was forming, not rushed, not forced, but built slowly on shared work and quiet respect. They were still cautious with each other. Trust does not grow in a single day. But each morning that began without fear, and each evening that ended in calm silence, strengthened the fragile understanding between them. What started as an act of shelter was slowly becoming something deeper, a partnership in survival. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew that life on the ranch would never be the same again. Winter settled over the land like a long, quiet warning. The mornings arrived covered in pale frost, and the wind carried a sharper edge than before. The ranch stood strong against the cold, but tension in the air felt heavier than the weather itself. Daniel noticed it first when fewer riders passed near his land. The road that once carried traders and neighbors now seemed emptier. When someone did ride by, they looked toward the house longer than necessary. Word had spread. The lonely cowboy was no longer alone. Iana felt it too. She could sense when eyes watched from a distance. Years of living carefully had sharpened that instinct. Still, she continued her work without complaint. She gathered firewood, checked water barrels before they froze, and prepared simple meals that stretched their supplies further than Daniel thought possible. One afternoon, while Daniel repaired part of the roof damaged by wind, Ayanna stood near the barn brushing one of the horses. The animal leaned into her touch calmly. The sky above them was gray, promising more cold before nightfall. In the distance, dust rose from the road. Daniel climbed down slowly from the ladder, narrowing his eyes. 3 riders approached the ranch. They were men from town. He recognized them by posture before he saw their faces clearly. Iyanna noticed his stillness. "Visitors?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "Stay near the house." She did not argue, but she also did not hide. She moved toward the porch and stood there, steady but alert. The riders stopped near the fence. One of them, a tall man named Harold, dismounted first. He was known for speaking loudly even when it wasn't needed. "Afternoon, Daniel," Harold called out. Daniel walked forward but did not cross the fence line. "What brings you out here?" The other 2 men stayed mounted, watching carefully. Harold removed his gloves slowly as if preparing for a long conversation. "We've been hearing things," he said. "Figured we'd come see for ourselves." Daniel's expression did not change. "You've seen enough. It's my land." Harold's eyes shifted toward Ayanna on the porch. He did not hide his disapproval. "This isn't about land," he replied. "People are uneasy. There's been talk of trouble in nearby areas. Folks think bringing someone from that side of things into the middle of it all isn't wise." Ayanna stood tall, her chin slightly raised. She did not lower her eyes. Daniel's voice remained calm but firm. "She hasn't brought trouble. She works harder than most men I know." One of the riders muttered something under his breath, but Daniel ignored it. Harold sighed. "We're just saying it might be better if she moved on, for everyone's sake." The wind swept across the yard, lifting loose straw into the air. The horses shifted restlessly. Daniel stepped closer to the fence. "No one under my roof is being forced out." His words hung in the cold air. The men exchanged looks. They had expected hesitation, not certainty. "You're making things harder than they need to be," Harold warned quietly. Daniel met his gaze without blinking. "Sometimes doing what's right is harder." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Harold pulled his gloves back on. "Don't say we didn't try to warn you," he said before mounting his horse again. The riders turned and headed back toward town, leaving behind silence thicker than before. Yana walked down from the porch once they disappeared beyond the hill. "You don't have to stand against them for me," she said softly. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the suggestion. "I'm not standing against anyone. I'm standing for what I believe." She studied his face, searching for doubt. She found none. That evening the sky darkened earlier than usual. Snow began to fall lightly, covering the ground in a thin white layer. Inside the house, the fire burned brighter than before. But the next morning brought signs that words alone would not settle everything. Daniel stepped outside to find part of his fence cut loose. A section near the far edge of the property had fallen overnight. A few cattle had wandered close to the boundary. He knelt beside the damaged wood, running his hand along the clean break. It had not been the wind. Ayanna approached quietly. She did not need to ask what happened. "They're trying to push you," she said. Daniel stood slowly. "They won't succeed." They worked together to guide the cattle back and repair the fence. Ayanna used the weaving method she had shown him before, strengthening the posts even more securely this time. As they worked side by side in the cold, something changed in their movements. There was no hesitation anymore, no uncertainty about standing together. Later that week, Daniel rode into town again, aware that tension had grown. Conversation stopped when he entered the store. A few men watched him openly now. Walter, the shopkeeper, handed him supplies without his usual small talk. "Fence trouble?" Walter asked quietly, noticing the extra wire Daniel purchased. Daniel nodded once. Walter hesitated. "Some people fear what they don't understand." Daniel replied simply, "Fear doesn't fix fences." Walter almost smiled at that, but it faded quickly. When Daniel returned home, he found Ayanna kneeling in the yard, pressing seeds into a small patch of soil near the house. It seemed too early in the season for planting, but she worked carefully. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Roots that grow strong and cold," she replied. "They don't give up easily." He understood the deeper meaning. Days passed, and though no one came openly to confront them again, small acts continued. A water barrel was tipped over one morning. A sack of feed disappeared another night. Instead of reacting with anger, Daniel and Ayanna focused on rebuilding each time. They rose earlier, worked longer, and protected what they had. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayanna finally spoke what had been weighing on her. "If my staying brings hardship to you, I can leave," she said quietly. Daniel looked up sharply. "You think I don't see what you bring here?" She waited. "This ranch hasn't felt alive in years," he continued. "Not because of cattle or crops, because I stopped living in it. You changed that." Her eyes softened slightly. "They want me to choose comfort over conscience," he added. "I won't." Silence filled the room again, but it felt steady, not uncertain. The real test came when a heavy snowstorm rolled in unexpectedly one night. The wind howled fiercely, and snow covered the paths within hours. Visibility dropped and the temperature fell sharply. Near midnight, a loud banging echoed against their door. Daniel grabbed his coat and opened it carefully. A young farmhand from a neighboring property stood outside, covered in snow and shivering. "Our cattle broke loose," the young man said urgently. "We can't find them in this storm." Daniel did not hesitate. He gathered ropes and lanterns. Iana stepped forward. "I'm coming too," she said. The storm was brutal, but together they moved across the frozen land, using Ayana's knowledge of wind direction and animal behavior to predict where the cattle might have taken shelter. After hours of searching, they found the animals clustered near a natural dip in the land, protected slightly from the wind. Working side by side, they guided the cattle back safely. By the time they returned home, dawn was breaking. News of their help traveled quickly through town. The same people who had questioned Ayana's presence now heard how her guidance had saved livestock during the storm. Whispers began to change. Not completely, not instantly, but enough. The next time Daniel rode into town, fewer eyes looked at him with suspicion. A few even nodded in greeting. Back at the ranch, Ayana stood near the small patch where she had planted the cold-resistant roots. Tiny green shoots had begun pushing through the soil despite the frost. She smiled faintly. The ranch still faced challenges. Trust from others would take time, but something stronger than fear had begun to take root: resilience. Daniel realized that standing firm had not divided him from everything. It had revealed who he truly was. And as he watched Ayana brush snow gently from the fragile green leaves, he understood that some growth only happens when tested by harsh seasons. They were no longer simply sharing a house. They were standing together, and that made all the difference. By the time the worst of winter passed, the ranch no longer felt like a place frozen in time. Snow still rested in quiet corners of the land, but the air carried a softer promise. The days grew slightly longer. Sunlight stayed a little later in the sky. And inside the small ranch house, something steady and warm had taken root. Daniel noticed the change in himself before he noticed it anywhere else. He began waking up with purpose instead of routine. For years, his mornings had felt the same: get up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. There had been no reason to look forward to anything. But now, when he stepped into the kitchen, there was already movement: the quiet sound of water heating, the smell of herbs Ayana had begun using in their meals, the sight of another cup placed across the table. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, Ayana was carefully grinding dried leaves with a small stone tool she had carried in her bundle since the day she arrived. Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching her without speaking. "This will help with the cough you've had," she said without looking up. He almost smiled. "I don't have a cough." "You clear your throat every morning," she replied calmly. He realized she was right. She handed him a warm cup filled with a mild herbal drink. It tasted different from anything he had tried before, but it soothed his chest almost immediately. "You learned that from your family?" he asked. She nodded. "My grandmother taught me. She said the land always gives what we need. We just have to learn to listen." Daniel sat down slowly. "I used to think I knew this land," he said, "but I only knew how to work it, not how to hear it." Gianna looked at him thoughtfully. "It is never too late to learn." That became their quiet pattern, learning from each other. As the snow melted, Daniel showed her how he tracked the health of his cattle, how he measured grain storage to last through dry seasons, how he kept simple records in an old leather-bound ledger. At first, she studied the pages with hesitation. Reading numbers and trade marks was unfamiliar to her, but Daniel was patient. "Every mark tells a story," he explained one evening, sliding the ledger across the table. "Not just about money, about survival." She began practicing slowly. Her fingers traced each line carefully. Within weeks, she could read the records well enough to point out small mistakes Daniel had overlooked. "You counted this shipment twice." she said one afternoon. Daniel looked over her shoulder and realized she was right. He chuckled softly. "Seems I need you more than I thought." She did not respond with pride. She simply corrected the page and continued. The ranch itself also began to show signs of improvement. The reinforced fences stood strong against wind. The cold-resistant plants she had placed near the house began spreading quietly through the soil. The horses looked calmer. Even the barn felt less empty. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of roof damaged months earlier, Daniel paused and looked out over the land. "It hasn't looked this steady in a long time," he admitted. Jana followed his gaze. "When something is cared for, it answers." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Meanwhile, the town's attitude continued shifting, slowly, carefully, like ice melting under the sun. The storm rescue had not been forgotten. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now offered small nods. A farmer whose cattle had been saved sent over a sack of flour in quiet thanks. Daniel did not celebrate the change. He understood that trust rebuilt slowly. But he noticed something else. Yana no longer stiffened when someone rode past the ranch. She still remained aware, but fear no longer controlled her steps. One evening, a knock came at their door. Daniel opened it to find Mrs. Turner, an older widow from town who rarely visited anyone. She held a basket covered with cloth. "I heard you've been working hard out here," she said gently. "Thought you might need fresh eggs." Daniel blinked in surprise but accepted the basket with gratitude. Mrs. Turner's eyes shifted toward Ayana, who stood near the table. "You're the one who helped find those cattle in the storm," she said. Ayana nodded politely. "Well," Mrs. Turner continued, "that was a brave thing. It wasn't loud praise, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough." After she left, Daniel set the basket down and looked at Ayana. "Seems the world hasn't completely turned against us." Ayana gave a faint smile. "Kindness travels too, just slower than fear." As spring began to show itself fully, the ranch required more attention. New calves were born. The fields needed preparing. Daniel found himself working longer hours, but he was no longer working alone. One early morning, while guiding a newborn calf toward its mother, Daniel slipped slightly in the mud. He steadied himself, but the brief loss of balance startled him. Jana reached out instinctively to support him. "You're not as young as you think," she said quietly. He laughed, a sound that surprised even him. It had been years since laughter came so easily. "Maybe not," he admitted. There was a new rhythm between them now, comfortable, steady, built on shared responsibility rather than obligation. In the evenings, after long days of labor, they often sat outside on the porch. The sky turned soft shades of gold and pink. The wind carried the scent of fresh soil instead of snow. One evening, Ayana began teaching him words from her language. "This means strength," she said, speaking slowly. Daniel repeated the word, his pronunciation rough but determined. She corrected him gently and he tried again. "And this?" he asked, pointing toward another word she had spoken earlier. "That means home," she replied. He paused. "Does it?" he asked quietly. She looked at the house, the barn, the fields stretching beyond. Then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "it can." The answer stayed with him long after the sun had disappeared. Healing does not happen in grand moments. It happens in small, steady choices, in shared meals, in repaired fences, in words spoken gently instead of sharply. Daniel found himself talking about memories he once locked away. He told her about his daughter chasing fireflies in the yard, about his wife singing softly while hanging laundry on the line. Speaking those memories no longer felt like reopening wounds. It felt like honoring them. Iana listened with deep respect. She shared stories, too, about her grandmother's laughter, about running through open fields as a child, about the sound of drums during gatherings long ago. Their losses were different, but the ache was similar. And in sharing those stories, the ache grew lighter. One afternoon, while Daniel rode into town for supplies, Ayana remained at the ranch alone. Months earlier, the idea might have filled her with worry. But now she moved confidently across the property, checking water levels and adjusting tools as needed. When Daniel returned, he found the barn reorganized more efficiently than before. "You've been busy," he observed. She nodded. It was time. He realized something important in that moment. She was no longer a guest. She was part of the place. Later that week, Harold, the same man who had once warned Daniel, rode past the ranch again. This time he slowed his horse and called out, "Fence looks solid." Daniel stepped forward. "It is." Harold glanced toward Yana, who stood nearby. He gave a brief nod before riding on. It wasn't an apology, but it was acceptance. That night, as the fire crackled inside the house, Daniel felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Peace. Not loud happiness. Not dramatic change. Just steady peace. The barn where Yana once hid now stood as a reminder, not of fear, but of a turning point. The house that once echoed with emptiness now held quiet conversation and shared understanding. And as spring fully claimed the land, both Daniel and Ayanna understood something without needing to say it aloud. They were no longer surviving alone. They were rebuilding, side by side. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, like a careful visitor testing the ground before stepping forward. The snow melted into thin streams that ran along the edges of the fields. The soil softened. Birds returned to the wooden fence posts as if they had always belonged there. The ranch, once quiet and heavy with winter, began to breathe again. Daniel stood on the porch one early morning, watching the sun rise over the land. The light touched the fields gently, turning the grass a brighter shade of green. For years, he had watched many sunrises without feeling anything change inside him. But this morning felt different. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of the front door opening. Yana stepped out carrying 2 cups of warm tea. She handed one to him without speaking. They stood side by side, looking over the ranch that had tested them both. "It looks stronger," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "It is." But he knew she was not just talking about the fences or the crops. Over the past months, the ranch had become more than a place to survive. It had become a place of rebuilding. The reinforced fences still stood firm. The small patch of cold-resistant plants near the house had spread into neat rows of healthy growth. Even the barn seemed brighter, cleaner, as if it had shed the memory of fear it once held. Word about the ranch had traveled beyond their small town. Travelers passing through began stopping for water or directions. Daniel noticed that more than once, people left with quiet respect in their eyes. One afternoon, a family traveling west stopped near the property. Their wagon wheel had broken, leaving them stranded. Without hesitation, Daniel offered tools and assistance. Gianna brought water and simple food for the children. As Daniel repaired the wheel, the father of the family looked around the ranch. "You've built something solid here," he said. Daniel glanced toward Ayanna, who was helping the children gather small wildflowers near the fence. "We didn't build it alone," Daniel replied. The father nodded thoughtfully. When the wagon was ready again, the family thanked them with sincere gratitude. Before leaving, the mother quietly pressed a small cloth bundle into Ayanna's hand. "For your kindness," she said. Inside were seeds, flowers meant for warmer seasons. That evening, Ayanna planted them carefully near the porch. "They will grow bright," she said. Daniel watched her kneel in the soil, her hands steady and sure. "So will everything else," he answered. The town, too, had changed in quiet ways. People who once whispered now greeted them openly. Mrs. Turner visited more often, bringing baked bread and stories from her younger days. Even Walter at the general store spoke to Ayanna directly when she accompanied Daniel into town. One morning, Harold rode up again. This time he dismounted without hesitation and approached the porch. "Fence held strong during last week's winds," he said, almost as if making conversation. "It did," Daniel replied. Harold cleared his throat. We could use advice on reinforcing ours the same way. Daniel looked toward Ayana. She stepped forward calmly. We can show you. There was no tension in her voice, no bitterness from the past, only willingness. Harold nodded once, gratitude replacing old doubt. As weeks passed, neighbors began visiting the ranch not out of suspicion, but curiosity and respect. Some came to learn about strengthening fences. Others asked about planting methods that could survive difficult seasons. Yana shared her knowledge freely. Daniel shared his experience managing livestock and land. The ranch slowly became known not just as Daniel's property, but as a place where cooperation mattered more than fear. One quiet evening, as the sky turned deep blue and the first stars appeared, Daniel and Ayana sat on the porch again. The flowers she had planted near the steps had begun to bloom in bright colors, yellow, red, and soft purple. They survived the cold, Daniel observed. Ayana smiled, strong roots. He was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. When I found you in the barn, he said, I didn't think beyond that night. She turned toward him, listening. I only knew I couldn't leave you there, he continued. I didn't expect everything else. Neither did I, she admitted. The wind moved gently across the fields, no longer harsh or sharp, just steady. Do you regret staying? He asked carefully. Ayana looked at the house, the barn, the open land stretching beyond the horizon. She thought about the fear she had carried when she first stepped inside that barn. She thought about the slow trust that had grown day by day. No, she said simply. I chose to stay. Her answer meant more than he could explain. Time continued moving forward as it always does. Seasons shifted. The ranch grew stronger. New calves were born. Crops yielded better harvests than they had in years. The ledger Daniel once kept alone now showed careful entries written in both their hands, but the greatest change could not be measured in numbers. The house no longer echoed at night. Laughter, though quiet, found its way into conversations. Shared meals felt full rather than silent. Memories of the past remained, but they no longer defined the present. One afternoon, as Daniel repaired a gate, he paused and looked toward the barn. He remembered the first moment he had pushed that door open and seen Ayana hiding behind the hay. He remembered the fear in her eyes. He remembered the choice he made without fully understanding it. That barn, once a place of hiding, had become something else. It was now used for storing grain and tools, organized neatly and filled with purpose. Life had turned that moment of uncertainty into a foundation. Later that day, a young boy from town approached the ranch, leading a small, injured goat. He looked nervous but determined. Mr. Mercer, the boy said, they told me you might help. Daniel knelt to examine the animal. Ayana joined him, carefully checking its leg. It will heal, she assured the boy, but it needs rest and care. They showed him how to wrap the leg gently and what herbs to use to ease swelling. The boy listened closely, grateful. As he left, Daniel watched him disappear down the road. You see, Yana said softly. The fear is fading, Daniel nodded. It always does, she continued, when people see something steady. That night, as they sat by the fire, Daniel realized something he had not admitted even to himself. He no longer felt like the lonely cowboy people once described. Loneliness had shaped him for years, but it no longer defined him. He had opened his door once out of simple decency. That single choice had changed the direction of his life. Yana, too, had transformed. The cautious woman who once measured every step now moved freely across the land. Strength had always been inside her, but now it had space to grow. Their bond did not need grand promises or dramatic words. It was built in quiet mornings, shared labor, and steady respect. It was built in moments when one stood firm so the other did not have to stand alone. As summer approached, the flowers near the porch bloomed fully, bright against the wooden steps. Daniel looked at them and then at Ayana. Funny, he said thoughtfully. All this started because of a barn door, she smiled gently. No, it started because you chose kindness. He considered that, perhaps she was right. Under the wide open sky, on land that had once felt empty and divided, two people from different worlds had created something rare: understanding without force, partnership without fear, and a home built not by history, but by choice. And every evening, as the sun set over the ranch, it no longer felt like the end of something.